first of all, Roseanne, thank you for agreeing to this because, because I'm appreciative of you. And I'm just thrilled that you're here 8 years later, maybe?
8 years later.
8 years later. And you remember, some of you were here when Roseanne was here with Pat Wall, who wrote the book about enslaved people in York County and elsewhere before there was a York County, I think. But not true.
York County came first. That was the whole state of Maine was York County.
Oh, yeah? Okay, well, that's why you two are here. And we'll have other voices. So Roseanne has asked me to describe this as a discussion group rather than a talk by her, but I've asked her to give a talk, at least an introduction, because none of us have quite the overview that Jerry has. At least I can speak for myself. So, welcome, thank you.
Thank you.
And you now have some people looking and listening with interest.
Well, thank you for inviting me. He actually invited me to come up and just spend some time and relax. And then probably about 6 hours later, it was, and would you mind giving a talk? And I said, hopefully it's not disappointing. But it's nice to be back. It has a lot of nice memories of meeting some of you and being here for a number of things and being here with my late husband. So I thank you for that privilege of coming back. You know, for many of you, you may be related to a man called Black Will, who came from Kittery. His son is the one who came to Bailey's Island. For me, I'm at the other side of that. I am descended from the slaveholder who had him. So I wanted to share this with you, and I'll try to read it as quickly as I can. It's something I wrote in one of those moments. You know, as an Anglo-Saxon, I'll say Protestant, woman of means and also privilege, I know who my ancestors are, and I can follow them back a long, long way. But for the enslaved people in this country, they cannot do that. And so to me, and their graves can't be found. I can show you where my family is buried. I can show you the old cemetery with the stones with no markings, but I know that's where, you know, Nicholas was buried in 1682, or Charles Frost was buried in 1697. But for the enslaved people who came here, of course, they can't. And so I wrote this story really about the brother of William Black, Jr., who came here to Bailey's Island. And this is about really his brother. But in it, you'll get a glimpse of the family and what happened, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we know about Black Will, as I call him, and it's not out of disrespect. It really is what is in the deeds and the land drawings. That's what his name was, Black Will. He was also called William Negro and Will Black. And as Jerry and I were talking this morning, that becomes very confusing. But I use Black Will because I want to honor that name, because that is the name by which he signed his X. And maybe it wasn't him saying that, but at least it gives him a person. So this is a story again about Joshua, his other son, Joshua. In 1696, an African man forcibly removed from his faraway homeland, from family, neighbors, from all that he had known and was familiar, and then forced into slavery, stood at a crossroad. For the first time since his enslavement, he was able to make a choice. They would take him from enslaved to landowner, and ultimately on a journey that would lead him to freedom. When this man's son Joshua died in 1754, he had been gone for 14 years. Joshua's family gathered at his mother and father's resting place to bury him. And this is the narrative of that burial. Again, this is pure fiction based on some historical documents. But this was what I envisioned when I thought about him. And you'll see why I wrote this. It wasn't a large gathering, but then it wasn't expected to be. Some neighbors, mostly just the family, with its growing extended family of Patch, Freeman, and Witham members, as daughters married and their families also came to live on what was left of the original 100 acres which Joshua's father Black Will had bought in 1696. It was an unusually warm morning in April as the small procession made its way from the house of Joshua Black on the east side of Marsh Hill. Close neighbors and friends joined Joshua's widow Mary and his daughters Mary Black and her husband William, Amy Freeman, Catherine, Sarah and her husband Nicholas Collins, Marjorie and Joshua's two sons Henry, wife Sally, and Thomas, all that was left of Joshua and Mary's 12 children. They traveled in silence, making their way through the woods and fields and up the hill on the old road that their neighbor Samuel Fernald had made, which led from his family's home on the top of Marsh Hill and connected the pieces of land that his family had acquired over the years with the lands of Squire Simon Frost on the old country road. Samuel had made sure that his road would remain in use by putting it in his deed. Samuel Fernald led the group. His wagon bore Joshua's simple wooden coffin. Samuel was the family's closest neighbor and had been a good friend to Joshua and his family. Joshua trusted Samuel and had sold him several pieces of the family lands when he was in debt. Joshua had made Samuel the executor of his estate and had been a great help during Joshua's last days. Samuel had made all the arrangements for the burial today, even helping Joshua's sons, Henry and Thomas, to dig the grave. Sitting next to Samuel was Dr. Edmund Coffin. Dr. Coffin had tended to Joshua during his last illness and arrived that morning, traveling over the old road that went from his home to the north, that skirted Sturgeon Creek and the marshes and connected the Blacks' lands to the property of John Hurd. Marjorie, 17, the youngest, lagged behind as usual, soaking up the sun, letting her thoughts run free as she breathed in the clear air and fought back her tears. The procession approached a stone wall. Her grandfather, who people called Black Will, had built this wall many years ago with the rocks he moved as he cleared his fields. They passed through the wall and came to what the family always called Black Will's field. Marjorie picked up a handful of the rich earth and sent her grandfather a silent prayer, thanking him for giving her family the gift of this land on which her brothers and sisters now live with their extended families, for struggling through the horror of being taken from his home far across the ocean and forced to become a slave, for enduring debt and harassment by mean neighbors and townspeople in times of bad crops, but through it all still keeping hold of his land. Without the strength and endurance of their grandfather, they would have had no place to live. Although she hadn't known her grandfather, Marjorie had heard about him, how he'd been a slave to Nicholas Shapley, but had earned the money to buy his own land, 100 acres. How he came to live on it after the widow Alice died, and much later the nephew John Shapley had, quote, freed him. She spat on the ground just thinking about what her grandfather had been through, the humiliation, the usage, being loaned out to others to pay off the Shapley debts, under that John who had, quote, inherited him. Nicholas, according to the family story, was a much different person and had given her grandfather 3 acres to live on, where he could build a cabin and start a family, but still, she thought, he shouldn't have kept him. It was wrong to own another person. The nephew John had died not soon after he had released her grandfather, taken down by the Indians. served him right. Shaking off the anger, she turned her face to the sound of the sheep grazing. In that moment, she could see her father Joshua with his wide and toothless smile, his long legs and lanky strides moving quickly as she tried to keep up with him. Even now, among their own sheep were those of Catherine Ferguson, whom her father was taking care of. She'd probably be coming to get them now that he was gone. Her thoughts moved to times that she and her father had spent together. She saw them walking down to Sturgeon Creek to fish. Oh, how those strange-looking sturgeons scared her. She would stand in back of him as he took his long knife and brought them under control. She couldn't count the many times they stood on the edge of the marsh and watched the geese who came there to feed, helping her father move the sheep and oxen and steer to their grazing grounds and tending to the pigs, as well as working the fields with him. He was a good man, and even though it seemed like they were always in debt and family members were being brought into court for not attending church and other silly reasons, her father always met troubles with a smile and a wink. Her father had been the glue that held them together, and Marjorie couldn't imagine how they would get on without him. Marjorie had to run now to catch up with the group, which had stopped at the edge of another field not far from what they called Morrill's Swamp. The newly dug grave lay next to that of Joshua's parents, Black Will and Sarah. Nearby were the graves of her sister Amy's husband, Tony, and his father, Anthony, as well as her brothers, Jonathan and Benjamin, some of the babies who had died so young. As Samuel Fernald and her brothers carefully lifted the coffin off the wagon and lowered Joshua Black into the cold, hard ground, Marjorie looked around at those now gathered. Her sisters had been crying and stood together holding hands with babies clinging to their skirts. Marjorie caught the eye of Judge Simon Frost, who had come down from his house on the country road and was standing off to the side. She recalled the story her grandfather told about Simon's ancestor, Major Charles Frost, how Frost had given her grandfather's friend Anthony his freedom, but not before he had made her grandfather sign a document putting his 100 acres up as a surety that Tony wouldn't be a burden to the Frost family. Marjorie always felt that if Major Frost had been a nicer man, he would have just freed Tony, but he wasn't. It had been 20 years ago, her cousin William had told her, that the Frosts came around demanding the land back. They said the Blacks owed the Frosts money for taking care of Tony before he died, but her family knew different, even though they couldn't prove it. The Frosts were very powerful, and her family didn't have the money to go to court and fight against them. Her father always spoke with pride of the fact that he was able to scrape up the money to pay the Frosts off. He said that his father had hung on to it for 31 years, and he sure as heck wasn't about to let it go without a fight. Now, with her father's death, would the Frosts come again after the land? She shivered and then reminded herself that Judge Simon and her son were not like the other members of the Frost family. They had always been good neighbors. The judge had loaned money to Joshua many times so he could pay off some debts, and also to her Uncle Will when her grandfather died so that Will could move. He would often come to visit and see how they were doing, advising the family when they were in trouble with the authorities and neighbors. No, Judge Frost was a good man. Standing under the shade of an old oak tree with her cousin William, Marjorie was just a toddler when William came down from North Yarmouth several years ago to marry her sister Mary and take her back with him. He said he was making a good living fishing and working in the mills on Orr's Island, and just last night had told them that he was thinking of selling the 50 acres given to him by his grandfather and buying more land on Orr's Island. Marjorie thought back to what her father had told her about William's father, Uncle Will. Dear grandfather had laid it out very carefully in his will, instructing her father Joshua and Uncle Will to take care of their mother Sarah. Perhaps her uncle didn't really feel so inclined to honor his father's wish, since Sarah really wasn't his mother. Uncle Will left the area, leaving Joshua to supply Sarah with 100 pounds of meat and 10 bushels of corn each year. Joshua did this, seeing to all her needs as she aged, right up to the last years of her life, and saw to her burial. For a moment, Marjorie hardened and felt angry that Will had shirked his responsibilities and had left her father to shoulder the burden. But then, in the whisper of the trees, Marjorie heard her father's voice reminding her that his brother Will was always the adventurous one of the family. Sitting around the hearth in the evening, he would tell them the story of how Nicholas Shapley had sent his friend Francis Small up to the great wilderness of Merikanik, Great Sebaskadegan Island, to live and establish a trading post. And our Uncle Will, after many years of trying to make a go of his lands in Berwick and struggling with the prejudice of the people against his wife, who was white, decided at the end of the Indian Wars to move to another small island near there that his father, Black Will, had told them about. Her father never seemed angry with his brother for leaving, and Marjorie couldn't recall a time he'd ever complained or uttered a harsh word against him. Joshua would just shrug and laugh and say with pride that they even named the island after him, Will's Island. Uncle Will, a man Marjorie had never met, had died 2 years ago, buried on an island she certainly would never see. It made her sad to realize that when Mary and William returned there, she would never see them again. It was nice, though, at least for a few days, to have the family all together again, even with the sadness they all felt. Marjorie awakened from her reverie just as Dr. Coffin was finishing his prayer. She watched as Thomas, Henry, and William were shoveling the dirt into the grave. As Thomas was laying a large fieldstone, Judge Simon headed back up the road to his house, and Dr. Coffin climbed on Samuel's wagon. The family headed back down the road through the fields and woods to Joshua's house in silence. They told each other they would come back later to properly mark their father's grave, but they never did. That they would always remember where he lay. But alas, with the passage of time, there's no one to remember just where the son of a former slave was laid to rest on that unusually warm April morning.
Good writing.
Very beautiful. Beautiful, yeah, beautiful use of language.
And as I said, you wouldn't know which are the facts, but the interpretation is in the day. Samuel Fernald became the executor. Simon Frost lived up the road. That road was perpetually Samuel Fernald's. And so the people who would have been there could have been there, because those were the only people left. So, and he was buried in April. He died in April and was buried. And so there's a lot of the factual in there, but then there's the interpretation. So I just wanted you to know that, so you don't think, really, that all happened. It's like, no, that didn't all happen. But so I thought, I'm in the midst of the chroniclers of William Black Jr. and Harpswell, so I'm not going to even attempt. I have my own feelings about what might have happened and what was going on, but I won't do that. And if I could find what I'm looking for, I'd be able to just go quickly. I do know, though, about the Black family in Elliott, which was Kittery at the time, and Berwick. But I can't find it, so do you think I can do it?
I wish I could help you, but
Yeah, that's very strange, but
if it's anything like my
yeah, I brought a lot of,
desk,
I got
it'll
it.
take you. There you go.
I got it. I got a lot of supplemental things. I brought with me information about where the only information we have about Black Will, other than the research that was done by Patricia Wall. I brought maps showing where Black Will's land was. So anyway, I got involved because in 2016, Patricia called me and she wanted to learn about slavery. Did I know anything about slavery in Elliott? Well, I'd just gotten through doing a mapping display, and I had research, people asking, and did research about places that might have been on the Underground Railroad, and I brought all that to a meeting at Portsmouth Library. And I wanted to know what she wanted. I wasn't just gonna say, here, look what I got. And I felt pretty proud of myself. I had, yeah. And I was 200 years too late because she was looking at slavery and she wanted to know where Black Will's land was. And so I came back from that, and my friend Eric Christian, who's also a relative, married into my then husband's family. He wasn't then, was it? Is like my compatriot. He's good with mapping. He can take the old deed and he can take the lines of that deed and he can help move that where it needs to be. And at one point we were in the wrong place in Elliott, and we soon learned that. And that's a whole story in itself, and I won't bring you that process, but it took months and months of research and going to Alfred, because the only deeds online back then went back to 1966. You had to go to Alfred and look through the old files and the old inventories of the 1600 deeds. You couldn't find them. And so we only had the description of the 100 acres and who was bordering it. And so we had to work, usually in genealogy and looking at a house, you work from the present back. But because we didn't know where the land was, we worked from the back to the front. And we took every name that was on that original deed. We looked at all the to and from grantee and grantor of all those people and tried to come to where it was. So anyway, so as I said, Black Will was enslaved by the family of Major Nicholas Shapley and his wife Alice. And Nicholas was the son of Alexander, who was the first to come to this country and settle in what was now Elliott. He had a fishing operation out of Warehouse Point in Kittery Point, but his manor house was in Elliott. And he owned, 830 acres that went from the Piscataqua River inland into Elliott. He owned his own ships. He had interest in the Newfoundland fishing industry and at the Isles of Shoals in the 17th century. And as I said, he set up his base of operations at Warehouse Point in Kittery. He was one of the town's first selectmen, along with Nicholas Frost and John Hurd, who lived in the section of Kittery, now Elliott, in eastern Elliott. He owned and operated lumber mills in Elliott and Kittery, which I think are important in the later part of the story. And Jerry and I can discuss that when we talk about Harpswell. The site is marked today. It is part of the home is still there, but it was built upon, built upon, and so. But it is marked in Elliott. He was one of many families who were involved in the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, of course. Shipping goods from New England and in return bringing back goods, bringing back slaves to this area. And Patricia outlines that in her book, so I won't get into that. So we're really not certain where Black Will was from or when he first came to the home of Nicholas and Alice Shapley, or how old he was at the time. It's possible he could have come here when Nicholas acquired a man named Coffey in 1676, but there's no way of knowing. And by the time of Nicholas' death in 1682, Black Will was living on 3 acres of his master's land near the Piscataqua. And he gave in his will to his wife Alice Black Will to be used for her lifetime, and the land that he lived on, the 3 acres, specifically for Black Will to live on. And so we presume it's near where Nicholas was living, because he certainly couldn't take care of her if he was inland, 3 or 4 miles inland in Elliott. So we assume, but there's no, because it belongs to it's for his use and belonged to the family, it was just included in subsequent deeds. There's no way of telling. So we surmise that Blackwell may have worked in Shapley's mills, and possibly those of Charles Frost as well, because Charles Frost had set up a mill with James Shapley in 1693 on Stony Brook, which is the York River, and they were neighbors. So it would not be uncommon for a family slave to be hired out to other people to work off a portion of the master's debt. And perhaps that is why he was able to keep some of the monies that he earned, because he had to be earning money in order to have money, in order to buy 100 acres, I believe for 25 pounds while being a slave. He was not a free man at the time. And there is a 1686 record that shows him doing some work for James Chadbourne in Berwick. So he may have done other work as well. In 1690, Blackwell fathered a son with a white woman, Alice Hanscom Metherell. And it's unclear if they were living together on these 3 acres at the time. And, but 6 years later, he was able to come up with 25 pounds and bought 100 acres of land from John Gowan. Not McGowan, but John Gowan. It would be another 4 years before he would be freed by Nicholas's nephew, John Shapley, in 1700. And Alice, by this time, had died, and John inherited her part of the estate, including Blackwell. So he was now his slave. Okay. So on these 100 acres, he built a house. And 8 years later, in 1708, he struck a deal with Lieutenant Charles Frost for the release of his friend, Tony. And he took the name Tony Freeman when he moved to that acreage. Frost had inherited Tony following the death of his father, Major Charles Frost, who was killed in 1697 by the native peoples. He was a very notorious Indian fighter, and there was some treachery that happened, and they got him. And I actually live in that area. That's where I live. In the agreement, Blackwell had to put up his 100 acres as a surety that the Frost family would never have to take care of Tony again. And they would take him to court. And they actually, I'll digress a minute, they actually took Joshua later to court to take back 40 acres. And Joshua had to pay 30 pounds, so many shillings, to get back that land. So that was land already paid to that family, but the heirs of Charles, again, said that wasn't his. He had no right to be there. It took a while to get him off the land. I guess he wouldn't move. I mean, why would he? You know, it was his land. But anyway, so Blackwell sold these 2 acres to Tony for him to live on, but there's no indication that Tony ever paid him for it. And he was still living on the land in 1721. But by 1735, Robert Cutt had possession, and he willed it to his daughter, Elizabeth Whipple. And we think Tony, it looks like he died around 1736. And that's when the heirs of the Frost estate tried to take the land from Blackwell's heirs to pay for expenses for a period of 2 years and 3 months. But as late as 1754, it was still being described as Tony's place in the deeds. So we know that it was there. Numerous times he and family members were brought to court for debt, for not attending church. But Blackwell was able to provide for his family now as a free man, and provide them a much better life. And some of those things that were talked about in the piece I wrote, that comes from his inventory. They had sheep, and they had fishing gear, and they had, a number of those things that would make their life easier and better. Gradually, he gathered to that 100 acres a small community of black and mixed race people, many of whom had married into the black family, the Freemans, the Withams, the Patches, in addition to Tony Freeman and his wife and children. One grandchild, Amy, the daughter of Joshua, married his friend Tony's only son, and other grandchildren married into Mitchell, Seawood, and Call families. At the time of Blackwell's death in 1727, there are at least 2 houses mentioned on the land, Blackwell's and his friend Tony's. And then we know a lot about what his house looked like, that it had a cellar, there was a barn, he had an orchard, which is described as being a nursery. They raised corn, had livestock, producing meat. They spun their own flax and wool and raised lambs, steers, heifers. They had cows for milk, and they fished. And they had land that provided necessary wood for building. Blackwell was able to retain his 100 acres right up until his death in 1727, a period of 31 years, which I think speaks really well when people were trying to take it away from him, that he was able to keep it. He died his will was probated in 1727. He had his wife Sarah, 2 sons, 1 daughter, each having a different mother. William's mother was Alice, as I said, Alice Hanscom Metherow. Joshua's was a woman named Mary, and daughter Elizabeth's mother was Elizabeth Brooks, all white women. In some documents, his son Joshua is called Black Joshua, and his brother William Negro, and Blackwell Jr. Blackwell had several grandchildren. However, he left his 100 acres to be divided. 50 would go to his son William and 50 to Joshua, but for his grandchildren. So William's 50 was to go to his son William, okay, which is your second William that settled on Orr's Island, okay. So, and the other, Joshua, was to hold it for his sons, Benjamin and Jonathan. And then he directed that the sons were to take care of their mother, providing them with that 100 pounds of meat and the corn, the 10 bushels of corn and other things during her lifetime, and to bear an equal part in her burial. And we know that didn't happen because the son, William, left for Berwick. So we know he wasn't doing that for his mother. William Jr. acquired his own lands in Berwick through a grant from the town and a purchase in 1714, and was living there by the time his son William, again here, was born in 1715, as shown by a deposition by Valentine Skates and Samuel Allen. And then William took off later with his wife and son William and a daughter to Harpswell, Maine, leaving Joshua to care for the mother, which may have led his brother Joshua, for some reason, to bring him to court in 1746. I couldn't see what the problem was, but he took him to court to get money from his own brother. So I think it might have been, he kind of shirked his duty. Benjamin and Jonathan deeded to Joshua, their father, their share in their grandfather's lands. And as I said, Charles Frost and John Frost, executives of Charles Frost, took him to court. He paid it slowly, that 50 acres that was on Joshua's side that had been in trust, passed out of the family until the last of it was deeded out in 1839. And those family members moved away to Portland and to Kittery and married into families in the area, as I said, the Mitchells and Seawards, etc. The 50 acres that Blackwell had given to his son William for his grandson William Jr., although they remained intact, was deeded out very early in 1760 and 61, when the proceeds were used to buy land on what is now Orr's Island by Black Will's grandson, William. And that's what the deeds show at that time. William Black Jr. had left my area in Kittery. The exact date still up in the air, but had first settled on Wills Island before his son moved to Orr's Island, and may have found, I'm sorry, now I've confused it again, but anyway, I used the wrong one.
Yep.
But anyway, he may have found his way to Casco Bay because his former master, Nicholas Shapley, had sent his friend Francis Small to purchase and settle on Sebastidegan Island in 1659. And that's where I have my thoughts about, but, I'm not gonna do that because Jerry knows what. So anyway, so we got that down, and then we know all the deeds of the land in Berwick, taken to court, the debts. We figure that William Black Jr. was there working his own, in the mills there, not his own mills, but he had a house there. He lived there, and this is shown by the deeds and the records. And our good friend Paul Beauvert and Pat live on lands that belonged to Black Will Jr. in Berwick, and they came up to back when we did, and I won't go into that. We just know the provenance of those because Paul and Pat have done that research.
Need, I thought I started it off. No, not me. Well, maybe it is.
Well, yeah.
Volume control. I hope that's down.
So,
It's off.
it's off.
The Zoom is off.
Oh,
Yep.
the Zoom is off,
Yep.
okay.
The Zoom is off.
Can we applaud yet?
No, I don't know. I might be done. Maybe I'm done. Yeah. Probably I'm done. Yeah. I don't know if there are any questions,
Comments, but we'll shift quite quickly to the discussion piece,
No.
where Jerry can weigh in
Yeah,
and
could-
give your voice a break, maybe, here. And Jerry, your part.
I have a part?
Yes, you have a role.
I have a part.
You have,
Well, as we were talking before, it's real easy to get confused with all the Will Blacks and Black Wills. So, we've started out with Black Will in Berwick. He had a son, William Black, who did live in, where were we, in Berwick? Yeah,
Berwick.
On Paul's property.
yeah.
I believe he had problems with the courts because of his white wife and the laws of fornication and bastardy, which were a pain because he had to keep paying fines. It was against the law for him to have married a white woman, so he was never going to correct this problem. And I think that was the whole part of the process of his wanting to leave the area, go somewhere where there was less law, and I think Bailey, I think what at the time was Cape Nuagan Island, Wills Island, Bailey Island, I think that was the draw for him to come up here. At the time, there was a big boom in the timber industries, and the Shapleys had mills that were screaming for product to cut up. But Casco Bay was was ripe for harvesting all these trees. And it was a big business up here, and I think Will also saw an opportunity here to come to Casco Bay, find work, find less supervision, and therefore less, fewer problems with his own personal life. Shapley did own what is now Great Island, but by the time that Will was up here, I believe it had been sold to maybe Richard Wharton
Yes, it is, yeah.
by quite a few years, maybe a couple of decades. So not to say that Will wasn't aware that Shapley had owned property up here, but the Shapley involvement was somewhat in the past. But I think Casco Bay was a happening place at that period of time. There were lots of different groups of men that were cutting timber on the neck, on the islands, everywhere in Casco Bay. So I think it was all very attractive to him to come up here and settle here. My theory as to why he chose Bailey Island to settle on comes from a paragraph in Wheeler's History of Brunswick, Topsham, and Harpswell. It's a brief paragraph that says that the men who were burning debris on Harpswell Neck, the embers from their bonfires had been picked up, carried to Bailey Island, caught the island on fire, and destroyed it.
I'll say we never gave you anything.
And my guess as to what they mean by destroyed it, it's a ledge, you can't really destroy it, but they burned all the trees on it. And so it had no more economic value. Its value was destroyed. Nobody wanted it. What better place to settle and get away from all the laws than Bailey Island? So that's, in the back of my mind, that's a reason why I think Will chose that island as a place to settle. But it was also close to the Neck, where he could find work. And yeah, I think it just worked out well for him. So that Will Black and his wife Elizabeth settled on Bailey Island, raised 2 children there, Elizabeth and another son, Will.
They weren't very inventive with names, especially.
They didn't do well with names. Yeah, both, there was Will and Elizabeth, the parents, who had Will and Elizabeth, the children.
Yeah.
Just makes the whole thing more complicated when you're trying to figure out who's who. Elizabeth kind of fades into the background. I don't know much of anything about her. But at some point, Will appears to have moved to Orr's Island, and he was the Will who inherited his grandfather's properties in Berwick and Kittery, and then used that money to buy from the Orr brothers the southern half of Orr's Island.
That same land that we're now.
The same land that we're now sitting on. I do think from a study of the deeds that Will Black did sell off a lot of that property in small pieces until most all of it was gone. And then at a later time, the Black family that are still in residence here on Orr's Island ended up buying it back from others. So I don't think it was a direct inheritance from the Blacks, from Will Black to the present Blacks. I think they were owners in between, which is also a complicating factor, but,
What would the years be that you're referring to? When did the third Will Black actually move from Will's Island to here? It could be just an approximate.
well, it's gonna have to be approximate because there's no documentation that, I know I have a
When
Cursor
Harpswell was
here somewhere.
incorporated in 1758, he was listed as being on Will's Island, correct?
In 1759,
59.
William Jr. and his son signed a petition, William and Elizabeth and his son, William, signed a petition addressed to the selectmen of the town of Yarmouth. William the Third, the one who settled on Orr, said he's from Little Sebastian, and William Jr. and Timothy Bailey also signed, say they're from Merrickanig. So that from this we know that William III had left his father on Will's Island by this time, and that Will Jr. and Bailey were living on Will's Island. And it's interesting because then there's the whole lore of, you know, Bailey kicked William Jr. off the island of Bailey's and all that stuff, which there's other deeds and statements that don't really corroborate that, but
So Will was on Bailey Island for a period of time.
Will
Yeah.
Jr., right?
Yeah.
Will Jr.
Yeah.
yeah.
was on Bailey Island with his family. And at that time, it's kind of debatable on who owned the island. Was it owned by the king? Yeah, ultimately, I guess so. But it was part of North Yarmouth, so was it owned by North Yarmouth? Maybe. There was a committee for the resettlement of North Yarmouth. They were in charge after a couple of the Indian Wars in assigning properties to people who wanted to come back to North Yarmouth and resettle. There were, I think, 5 or 6 men on this committee. All of them were from Massachusetts. I don't know that any of them were actually in residence in North Yarmouth, but they were given that responsibility for the resettlement of North Yarmouth. They, of course, resettled the mainland first, but there were these islands that were off here. So after a 5 or 6 year period of resettlement, they apparently decided that they could reward themselves by assigning themselves some property on the islands. Orr's Island, or Little Sebascodegan Island, was assigned to Mr. Cook and Mr. Taylor. And Joseph, was it Joseph? It was either Joseph or William Dudley, one or the other, decided that he wanted the island where Black Will lived. The committee gave him a deed, but they screwed up, and they gave him a deed to Haskell's Island. And he said, no, that's not what I wanted. I wanted the one where Will lives. He was very specific. I want Will's Island. So he gave the committee a deed back for Haskell's Island, received a deed for the island where Will lived, and he became the non-resident owner. So Will, I think, had lived, I would have to go back and look at dates, but I think Will had lived on Bailey Island, on Will's Island,
Yeah.
for
Trying to sleep here.
maybe 9 or 10 years before Dudley bought the island. He continued to live there. But a couple of years after Dudley had bought the island, Timothy Bailey and his wife showed up from Scituate, and they ended up living on Bailey Island. They didn't own it, but they moved onto the island and apparently lived nearly side by side with Will for maybe another 14 or 15 years. Then just before Harpswell became a town in 1758, Dudley had died. I'm not quite certain whether Bailey bought the property from the heirs of Dudley. Some of the records say he bought it from the proprietors. So maybe Dudley's family sold it back to the proprietors. It's very unclear about why Bailey buys it from the proprietors when Dudley owned it. It's unclear.
Yeah.
And I've never yet located a deed that states what Timothy Bailey paid for the island. The rumor is a jug of rum and a beaver skin. I find that unlikely, but maybe. But I would love to see that deed that says what he bought it for. But at that point, Bailey and Black had been living together on this island for quite some time. Apparently peacefully.
Where did they live on the island?
So Timothy Bailey built, but they both lived on the north end of the island. In the vicinity of Water Cove and where the Bailey Island Bridge is now located in Garrison Cove. Garrison Cove is so called because Timothy Bailey built a garrison house there to protect the island residents from attacks. Don't know exactly where the house itself sat, but my assumption is between the main road and the Garrison Cove Road, he built a homestead there. And my feeling is that Will was on the other side of what is now the main road, on the Mingo Cove side. That seems like a likely place to put a homestead. It's a rocky beach, but there's good water access to a cove. The water is reasonably deep there. You wouldn't have had to carry things up over a bank. You could carry your goods across the shore there. Seems like a likely place for them to have built. There is a deed which refers to that point where the bridge is as Will's Point. There's only one deed that says that, but it does say Will's Point. It's possible it could mean the other side of Water Cove, but I don't think so. I also have heard stories of a freshwater spring coming down off of the high ground down toward Mingo Cove. So we may have chosen that spot as because of freshwater supply, although there are a number of freshwater supplies on Bailey Island at that time. But the Garrison House was later, the Bailey homestead was later bought by the Gardner family. And one of the Gardners, I think it was Seth Gardner, is said to have plowed the ground where the Garrison House was, so that foundation or that site was kind of erased. But the Gardners lived on the Bailey homestead, and their house burned in the early 1800s, and then they they kind of scattered around. Some moved to Portland, some moved to Oars Island. But I believe Will and the Baileys were at the north end of Oars Island, not down at Mackerel Cove where some of the histories would put
The
them.
north end of Wills Island.
The north end of Wills Island.
Yes.
Are the Dudleys that are down there any
No,
relation to any of those Dudleys that you talked about?
no. No, the Dudleys that owned the island early on and were part of the resettlement committee, they were all Massachusetts mucky mucks. They were, I think it was Joseph was the one that was on the committee, and his father, William, was governor of Massachusetts, appointed by the king. I'm not sure that any of them ever actually resided in what's now Maine. I think they just had jurisdiction over the area. I don't believe Mr. Dudley ever set foot on the island. I don't know why he wanted the specific one that Will lived on. Don't have a clue. So far as I know, they never attempted to build any fishing stations there. Like I said, I think the island was burned over, so there weren't many trees. So it really had no economic value.
But it did have spring water, right?
Well, it did have spring water,
That
but
was-
there were
that
lots of
was-
springs at that period of time
Really?
around everywhere.
Wasn't there an early fishing station on the end of Land's End down there?
There was one down there, but it was after.
Was
Well,
that far back?
I don't think it was that far back. Now, having said that, I wasn't there. There could have been something before the one that I know of.
Yeah.
But I have a deed, in the registry of deeds, there is a deposition where the man that owned the fishing station down there owed someone some money. So the constables of Harpswell, so this would have been after 1758. The constables were sent down to evaluate the property and report to the judge, who would then require that parts of it be sold off to settle the debt. And it was quite a fishing station. It had wharves and warehouses, and I think it was a fish drying station for
Fish
dried salt
flakes and all.
fish.
Fish flakes.
But it seemed to be substantial from what I was reading in that deed. And there was, on the south end of Harpswell Neck, there were a couple of fishing stations. But I don't think there was ever anything on Bailey Island, or Oars Island for that matter, for any kind of a substantial fishing area early on. Bailey Island had a number of places after it started to be settled. Lowell's Cove was a big fish drying area. Obviously, the Prince's at the south end of Oars Island was big for drying fish.
Yeah.